The silk is gone. The gold is gone. The incense that once perfumed every room she entered has been replaced by the smell of her own unwashed body and the leather armor of the Roman soldiers who stand inside her chamber, not outside. Inside, watching her every movement, every breath, every moment, she closes her eyes. Cleopatra's seventh, Cleopatra, is 39 years old, and she sits on a wooden chair that was once a servant's seat, can feel the rough grain of it through the thin linen shift they have left her to wear, can hear the soldiers discussing her in Latin they assume she does not understand, can taste the copper of blood in her mouth, from where she bit through her own lip 3 days ago when they told her what Octavian planned to do with her in Rome. She was, until 23 days ago, the last pharaoh of Egypt, ruler of the wealthiest kingdom in the Mediterranean, lover of Julius Caesar, wife of Mark Antony, mother of 4 children, who carried the blood of both Ptolemaic and Roman dynasties. She commanded fleets. She negotiated with emperors. She spoke 9 languages and could argue philosophy with scholars and strategy with generals. The Library of Alexandria existed because her ancestors built it. The lighthouse that guided ships to harbor bore her family's name. She was Isis incarnate, the living goddess, the queen of kings. Now she is a prisoner in her own palace, surrounded by men who have been given specific instructions about what they may do to keep her alive, and what they may do to her while keeping her alive. Wearing a garment so thin she might as well be naked, watching the door that no longer locks from the inside, counting the hours until Octavian decides he has extracted enough information and enough degradation and enough broken compliance to transport her to Rome for what comes next. She does not know yet that her son Caesarion, 17 years old, the child she made with Julius Caesar, the boy who should have inherited both Egypt and Rome, has already been captured trying to flee to India. She does not know that he is being brought back to Alexandria specifically so Octavian can decide whether to execute him in front of her or after she is gone. She does not know that her 3 younger children, the twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, age 10, and little Ptolemy Philadelphus, age 6, have already been designated as property of the Roman state, to be raised in Octavian's household as living trophies of his conquest. What she knows is that the guards changed shifts 2 hours ago. What she knows is that the night shift guards are different from the day shift guards. What she knows is that the night shift commander, a centurion named Gaius Cornelius Gallus, has made it very clear what he expects from her in exchange for small mercies like water and blankets and moments of privacy to relieve herself. Without an audience. What she knows is that her death is the only thing she still controls. And what she does not yet know, what tonight you will learn, is that what happened to her in those final 23 days was worse than the romantic myths ever revealed. That the snake was a mercy compared to what Octavian had planned. That the woman who chose her own death did so not from romantic despair, but from calculated understanding that the alternative was so horrific that oblivion was preferable. What you are about to learn has been deliberately buried for 2,000 years beneath romantic mythology that served Roman propaganda and Victorian fantasy. You know the story they taught you, the beautiful queen, the tragic love affair, the dramatic suicide with the asp at her breast. Hollywood has shown you Elizabeth Taylor draped in gold, speaking of love eternal, dying beautifully in silk sheets while sad music plays. This is not that story. Tonight you will learn what actually happened to Cleopatra after the Battle of Actium, the naval disaster that destroyed her fleet, bankrupted her kingdom, and left her trapped in Egypt that was already being carved up by Roman administrators before she had even formally surrendered. You will learn what Mark Antony's death actually looked like. Not the heroic Roman suicide of legend, but a botched, agonizing, hours-long process that Cleopatra was forced to witness while covered in his blood. You will learn what it meant to be Octavian's prisoner, what the Roman guards did during night shifts, what interrogation looked like when the interrogators knew you had hidden treasure somewhere and were willing to do whatever was necessary to find it, what it meant to be kept alive, not out of mercy, but because your living body had more propaganda value than your corpse. You will learn what Octavian planned to do with her in Rome, the chains, the public humiliation, the slow parade through jeering crowds, the display of a living goddess reduced to defeated property. You will understand why, when Cleopatra learned the details of this plan, she began actively seeking any means of death that her captors might have overlooked. You will learn what happened to her children, what Rome did to the son of Julius Caesar, where the twins were taken, how Octavian erased not just a queen but an entire bloodline, systematically, deliberately, as matter of imperial policy. Subscribe if you want to understand what empires do to the women who dare to resist them. Comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from. Because Cleopatra is sitting in that wooden chair, listening to the guards decide what to do with her tonight, and I am going to tell you exactly what her final 23 days contained, what the history books sanitized, what the legends romanticized, what Rome wanted the world to forget. But first I need to warn you, this is not a love story. This is not a tragedy in the classical sense. This is the systematic destruction of a human being who happened to be the last obstacle to Roman domination of the Mediterranean world. The suffering you are about to learn about was not divine punishment or romantic fate. It was policy. It was calculated. It was what empires do. Let us begin with the moment everything fell apart. The Battle of Actium was fought on September 2nd, 31 years before the Common Era, in the waters off the western coast of Greece. Cleopatra commanded 60 Egyptian warships, the finest vessels in her fleet, crewed by men who had been trained in naval warfare for generations. Mark Antony commanded the combined Roman and Allied forces loyal to their cause, approximately 230 ships in total against Octavian's 400. The numbers alone told the story. But numbers do not capture what the battle actually meant. Cleopatra watched from her flagship a massive vessel called the Antonias, as the Roman formation closed around Antony's fleet like a fist. She watched as ship after ship was grappled, boarded, set ablaze. She watched men she had known for years die in water that turned red and then black with blood and ash. She watched the smoke rise so thick that the September sun became a red disk, barely visible through the haze. And then she made a decision that history has debated for 2,000 years. She ordered her squadron to break through the Roman line and flee south toward Egypt. Roman historians called this cowardice. Modern historians call it strategic retreat. What it actually was, according to fragments of letters that survived in the Alexandria archives until they were destroyed centuries later, was recognition that the battle was already lost and that preserving 60 ships and their crews more valuable than adding them to the disaster. Antony saw her sails turning south. He abandoned his flagship, transferred to a smaller vessel, and chased after her. He left his fleet, left his men, left the battle, left everything to follow the woman he loved toward a kingdom that was already dying. They did not speak for 3 days after reuniting at sea. According to a servant who attended Cleopatra during the voyage back to Egypt, a woman named Charmian, who would eventually die beside her queen, Cleopatra spent those 3 days in her cabin, refusing food, refusing conversation, writing letters she immediately burned. The servant's account, preserved in fragments quoted by later historians, describes the queen's state in clinical terms that modern psychologists recognize immediately. She does not sleep. She does not eat. She sits and writes and burns and writes again. When I enter to bring water, she does not seem to see me. Her eyes are open, but they look at nothing in this world. I fear the queen is already somewhere else, somewhere inside herself where none of us can reach her. Cleopatra was not merely grieving. She was calculating. Egypt's treasury was depleted by years of funding Antony's military campaigns. The grain harvest had failed 2 years in succession, leaving the population hungry and restless. The Roman merchants who had once filled Alexandria's markets were gone, recalled to Italy on Octavian's orders. The allied kingdoms that had once sent tribute and trade goods had already begun negotiating with Rome for separate pieces. She had perhaps 12 months before Egypt's economy collapsed entirely. She had perhaps 6 months before the population grew desperate enough to riot. She had perhaps 3 months before Octavian's armies arrived at her borders demanding surrender. And she had a choice to make. She could offer Octavian whatever he wanted, in exchange for her children's safety and some fragment of autonomy. She could fight, fortify Alexandria, arm the population, force Rome into a siege that would cost them dearly even if they eventually won. Or she could flee, take her treasure, her children, her remaining ships, and try to establish a new kingdom somewhere beyond Rome's reach. She chose to try all three simultaneously. This was either brilliant or desperate. History has never quite decided which. The months between Actium and the final fall of Alexandria were not, as romantic histories